go. Alrighty. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Growing with Fishes podcast, episode 176. This week, we have a lawyer, Ann Kelson, with us.
Hey, everybody. Honored to join you.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. Everybody knows Roger's having some family stuff going on, and Marty had some family stuff going on tonight. So just me tonight as far as the panel. I'm not sure what's up with Green Jeans, but we'll have the rest of the panel back, I'm sure, on Tuesday or Thursday. One thing I did want to mention real quick, and this was just really, I'm going to mention it right away to publicize it because it just has to be, because this was, this just made my blood boil. And there's people, very good people working to help him. So there was a member of our community, a lot of people have been helping, Nick Risden, and he was assaulted by police today in a hospital when somebody said they smelled marijuana. He's being treated for medical stuff, and I'm not going to get into his personal details, but he's being treated for some medical stuff, and he was violently assaulted today by police in a hospital in heavy treatment, and it was pretty fucked up. So when this goes out there, we need help, getting this out there in the media and making sure that everybody knows about this, make sure that this never happens to anybody again. Yeah, I don't even know what to say. It was so super fucked up, but we found some really awesome people and some awesome lawyers, and we're going to try and get them some help, and the community has helped them out a hell of a lot so far. I'm sure they're going to keep helping them out as well, but I just wanted to help put a spotlight to it, because it's the best way to prevent this kind of stuff from happening again, is to make sure people know that it happened. And I'm not going to say any details because it's not really, not trying to spread his business either, but this was too fucked up and too wrong, so all right. On a better note, thanks for joining us. Why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background, and then we'll go into a little bit about some of the stuff we were talking about before the show.
Okay. Okay. So my name is Ann Kelson, and I'm based in Oakland, California. I actually grew up here, but I've lived in a lot of different places. You can actually see a piece of calligraphy from one of the countries I used to live in before I became a lawyer. And yeah, so I've been practicing for about 10 years. I'm a cannabis lawyer, cannabis business lawyer. I do advice and counsel work as it relates to employment laws. I do regulatory compliance, intellectual property, just, service contracts and the like. I also do have some other incarnations. One of my great passions is constitutional law. And I'm also, so fascinated about the intersection between plants, medicine, intellectual property, and our rights. I think there's a lot there, and that's one of my orientations towards being in cannabis law. I could talk a little bit more about my prior background, but I know tonight some of the things we wanted to cover were SB 34, the Dennis Perone Brownie Mary Act, which I had the honor to work on with a variety of activists, and also Senator Weiner, his aide Angela Hill, and some other people we'll discuss. And also I'm currently working on appellation rights with some different associations and lawyers and the like, and creating a symposium for next year. So we'll talk a little bit about that. What else? I practice at McAllister Garfield, where I'm of counsel, and I also work at Kelson Law Group, which is in Oakland. And I know there's more to say. So much going on. I think before we went on air, we were talking about both, like expansion and contraction generally. Because when we look at appellations, it's like so inspiring and could be the future. I hope it is the future. We're doing the work for that. But then there's also just, these harsh realities that we're in right now of, contraction and really like just many front war, so to speak, in some ways. But with that, I'll hand it back to you, Stephen.
Yeah, so you did a lot of work on SB 34. I know you have probably a better perspective than most on that. So why don't you start with that? A lot of people don't know that was one of the biggest things. That's actually how I met Dennis. Was actually both of us were talking at an event, speaking out against Amendment 64,
Oh,
and
wow.
together, and ended up getting to meet him there, and he was super funny, and got to meet Wayne and Laura and Kara
Uh-huh.
that first time, and then gotten to become friends with them since then, which is always fun to hang out with. I don't think I've ever not laughed hanging out with Wayne, but um, so yeah, so that was actually how I met it. And so they passed Amendment 64, and what it is was it really took away people's ability to donate medicine to people, and then it also really heavily restricted medical patients, and restricted their access to medicine. And you worked really hard to at least kick down some of those doors that they had put up with that.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, it was really so timely. I moved back to the Bay Area where I'm from in the fall of 2017. And so, like everyone, I was just, processing these proposed regulations and going to as many like talks and events and seminars. And so part of my education around this transition was going to, different speeches and talks like blunt talks. And I had the pleasure not of meeting Dennis Peron directly, but I was in the same room with him in that fall. And I really wanted to go up and talk with him, but I could tell, from a distance that maybe he was a little bit frail. I didn't know the circumstances fully, but I was just kind of like so in awe. I didn't even know how to fangirl, wanted to respect him. And then so surreptitiously, surreptitious is weird, synchronistically, I ended up connecting directly with some of the other people that, like you mentioned, Wayne and patient number one, and some of the compassion programs that had been operating, and some that had ceased operating. And so yeah, I mean, really what happened was I went to a blunt talk and it was really neat because Dennis Peron was there, and he was so happy to see the young activists and operators and people like elevating the discussion. And the very next month I went back and people were talking about how these compassionate care programs were getting taxed, and how medicine was going to dry up really fast, and how like somehow there was this huge gap in the law. It was really strange because I went down to Santa Cruz first. I mean, I'm just telling this because it's almost magical. And I saw Valerie Corral speak. This was in the late fall of 2017. And I saw some people from SC Veterans and some of the other, big compassionate care programs speaking and talking about this whole conundrum of like, what do we do? How do we even apply a tax to medicine? What's going to happen to the supply? How do we this is an emergency. The very next night in San Francisco, I went to another blunt talk, and there was, one compassionate care program activist talking about the same thing. They asked for legal help. It was my friend Ryan Miller from Operation Evac. So proud of him. And my friend Joseph Aroni and pro bono client Sweet Leaf Joe was sitting right there as well. And I met him, and he followed up and actually was like, yeah, we really do need help. And so, very quickly there was this, coalition that was formed of compassionate care programs and me. And then eventually I was honored to get Dale Schaefer, who's an amazing activist and lawyer. He actually, served and was able to keep his bar card, but, went to jail for some very intense things back in Prop 215 that very much center on patient rights and the law. So he's one of my personal heroes, and he got right in there with me. But just in the midst of this, Dennis Peron passed away, and I didn't know him. I never had that. But all of a sudden I met Wayne, I met Laura, I met so many of the people I think of, like these other activists who, learned from Dennis, and some who knew him very well. Valerie Corral had one of the longest running compassionate care programs, and she was part of the coalition still. WHAM is continuing onwards, I believe. And, Joseph Aroni from Sweetleaf is, continuing on in different capacity, but that's fast forward now 2 years. So The reality was that in January, we were at a public health crisis. I know I'm probably talking really fast, but Dennis Peron passed away right when that happened. And we all kind of rushed into the first cannabis advisory public hearing, which was with volunteers who had been appointed by the, I think they had applied and been appointed by the agencies to, have these different hearings from stakeholders. And, a bunch of us in this coalition, different people, went to the hearings and said, sounding the alarm and saying, we have a public health emergency on our hands. There are patients that can't access medicine anymore. These programs are getting taxed. They're the supply chain is, just starting up, and yet there's this huge gap in the law where they wanted to treat any cannabis transaction that was a donation as a sale. And what that really means, to slow down, is that for any cannabis that was donated across the supply chain from January of 2018 onwards, both the excise tax some people were paying, which is 15%, and the cultivation tax and the local tax, even if there was no sale. So that means you're having to come up with 40% or more of what the actual cost of the cannabis was up front just to get it to patients. Okay. It was prohibitive. It was definitely not something that was the correct application of the law, in my opinion. I know I should slow down, but this is how we had to get in immediately. And it actually took almost 2 years, to get this law passed. We're now in November of 2019. So 2 legislative cycles. But I should slow down and let you kind of interject there, because I just started on the public hearings and we didn't even get to how this even started to become a bill.
No, no, no,
Uh,
go ahead. I don't need to interject at all. Go, please tell us more.
so what's fascinating that most people don't know is that the Bureau actually offered to meet with us, and we did meet in private twice. So it's kind of, in a way, something I'd like people to know, because they did actually take seriously all of the patient testimony that was provided at these hearings. We had amazing well articulated people who have been, the compassionate care programs and providers, and folks like Wayne Jessman that you mentioned, patient number one. Valerie Corral was right up there, Ralph Trueblood. I could go on and on. Of course, Ryan Miller, Sweet Leaf Joe, everyone, came out with their patients. And so the BCC met with us twice. We started talking about, potential regulations maybe that could be created. And it was really, I think at that point, an open question as to whether or not we could get some kind of reform by way of regulation, or whether we had to go by way of an actual law that goes through, the Senate and the Assembly and gets the governor's signature. And I think the tension around how much an agency can regulate and how much, the legislative body can create laws is a very gray place in some ways. In other ways, maybe it's more clear. But the good thing is that the CDTFA, our taxing agency, got, confronted in all these hearings, and they finally said, okay, guys, you don't have to pay the excise tax. And while we had this, at that point, Senator Scott Wiener had gotten involved, very concerned. Senator from San Francisco, from the Castro district, representing that district, first as a supervisor, county supervisor, and then now a state senator, very much felt that he needed to be sure that this emergency did not get, unaddressed. And he actually quite heroically, I'm skipping ahead, while we were kind of waiting for the BCC to help us, and I commend them for meeting with us. I can't say very much more about it, but I do really appreciate it. He got in there and he saw that, this was something where, the very patients in his district and, historically the people who created, Prop 215, Dennis Peron's very neighborhood, needed to make sure that there were protections to carry out these legacies, because there still are patients who have wasting syndrome. There still are patients who have cancer. One of Sweetleaf Joe's patients is a patient who has HIV, who is a veteran, who has also had different bouts of cancer, okay, who is terminally ill, low income patient. So these are the kind of like cross section of people that were being affected and still are affected right now by way of like how our laws have been implemented. And so, you know, he basically went and created the opportunity to take what was another proposed set of laws, I believe this is kind of complicated to explain, and essentially gutted what was part of a bill and inserted some of this new proposed law.
So
And sorry, go ahead.
speaking of Sweet Leaf Joe.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, is that him?
Hey there.
Yay! Oh my God, Joe, you didn't know we were going on, did you?
No, I didn't. I was actually sending out stuff to different media earlier about the upcoming giveaway with Hall of Flowers and Garden of Eden. And
Amazing.
yeah,
You were dotting my eyes. I should have told you about this. It's been going, my whole week's been so fast. You're amazing. Okay, fast forward to where we are now. Joe, you've been tracking the show a little bit, right?
right now?
So,
Yeah.
so I was gonna say,
No, actually, no, I haven't. I just got the link, and then I was like, oh, I'll call in. I was like watching a movie.
Yeah. So,
Joe, do you want to pop in for a second and tell us about your what you got going on for a second? Not to
sure.
totally interrupt, but
so I'm Sweet Leaf Joe, and I'm the founder and director of the Sweet Leaf Collective, and we provide free medical cannabis to low-income, terminally ill Californians. And we've been doing it since '96. Did it for a while under 215, and now with 64, we've had to do these creative pivots and figure out how to continue the compassion mission.
So Joe, we were like in the middle of kind of telling the story of, like how it all started with the public hearing, the advisory hearings, and then the bill. But like, we haven't gotten to like what SB 34 ended up being. But like, I think it's so important for you to talk about how quickly, in some ways, when we talk about like how long things take in cannabis time or cannabis law time, dog years, right?
Oh man.
Now like actively working with something like Hall of Flowers to do something good for patients. But can you tell us initially where the problem, or where, kind of what you're solving right now, how that started with Hall of Flowers, and kind of like how this is going to help patients a little bit more?
Oh yeah, well, so the Hall of Flowers giveaway is we're going to be doing it within the next week, and Hall of Flowers, they had a bunch of leftovers from an event. I want to say it was probably like 9 months ago or something, and they were required to destroy it. And when they were doing that, some of the people working there, they knew about compassionate cannabis, and they wanted to make sure that the next time there were leftovers, that it would go to compassion. And so they did an event, I think it was a month or two ago, and they have some leftover product, and they are donating that to Sweet Leaf patients and also to Operation EVAC patients. And it's just great to see people in the industry who want to get things to compassion. Instead of destroying it, it's completely usable product that these people are being required to destroy, when actually we can get it to the patients that need it.
Yeah, I actually attended all three Hall of Flowers, and I think the first Hall of Flowers was where this issue came up, and it was like, I almost want to say it was like, okay, in the spring of 2018, maybe late spring. And what happened was, as you described, there was, there were samples that people would get attending this B2B trade show. But at the end of the fair, there was actually a lot left over. I mean, flower, pre-rolls, what have you. But because of the regulations and because of the way the plan for that event was implemented, they were required to destroy the cannabis, everything, all of those different kinds of goods. And, just as Joe said, people were really upset about it because, it was tested, it was good. It would have been anything that you could put in a dispensary, for sale otherwise. And it was just, completely rendered unusable, when it could possibly in a different way if we had planned things differently gone to the patients. So, for me, SB 34 took from January of 2018 all the way to, a month ago. And in between, we had one Hall of Flowers where this happened. And then, Hall of Flowers happened a couple more times. And there wasn't so much of a waste issue, I believe. But, people are working on it. And now, Joe, like, it's amazing. You're, working directly with licensees to make sure that patients can get really safe, tested medicine, through the licensed supply chain, you know, with all of that accounted for. So great work.
Yeah, it feels good. And it's just great to see people in the cannabis industry that want to support compassion. And, I think this is going to set a great precedent for other cannabis events where if they do have leftovers, like, hey, let's get it to compassion.
And that's, just going kind of to the heart of the matter, I think part of why it took so very long, besides all of the normal gridlock in Sacramento and then some, because we're kind of in chaos land the last 2 years, both building the plane and flying it, so to speak, as people have been talking about again recently. And, in the midst of all that, it's just like trying to get cannabis consistently to patients through documented and compliant compassionate care programs has been very hard. I know Joe can speak to that much more at length. So Joe, like, while we were going through all of these different hearings and, both in Sacramento, once we had a bill and, even the advisory committees and, the last year or so, how has it been for your patients? How have they been impacted?
It's been difficult. Definitely the amount of cannabis that we've been able to help facilitate giving away has dropped dramatically. I feel like we're at a point now where we've navigated parts of the supply chain, and so we are able to get some compassion out to our patients. But we are still liable for the taxes, so we've had to do fundraising to pay for the taxes on the cannabis that we're giving away for free. So with SB 34, when that gets implemented in March, that will then remove those taxes, so we won't be required to pay that, which is going to be great.
Right, because part of, I think, the frustrating thing I was getting to was bringing this bill forward twice in two different leg cycles and having it pass through both the Senate and the Assembly. I can go back to that, and then Governor Brown vetoing it, and then this last cycle. You've had patients that have been seriously impacted, right? I believe you've had patients that have even passed away, and we've talked about this.
Yeah, we have.
This isn't really, and at the same time, one of the biggest concerns has been diversion. But, ultimately, as you and I both know, according to the law, when you work through the licensed supply chain, you have to keep records for 7 years of everything, including working with a program like yours. And so
yeah.
I'm venting here, but, I was talking with a journalist recently and they were asking me, how much of a percentage of medicine should be donated to patients. And I was almost balking in a sense because, my first instinct is rooted in, the way that you provided medicine to patients before these, regulations came into effect under Prop 215, which is, as much as the cultivators could stand to donate and want to donate consistently to, the terminally ill and, or veterans and these vulnerable populations. But, the real reality, right, is that, having to cover these taxes has seriously constricted the ability to do so. And even when those taxes are alleviated, it's still an incredibly difficult thing for a licensee to be able to set aside a serious amount of cannabis consistently, right?
Oh yeah, and that's just one thing too. We're basically relying on the kindness of other cannabis companies, permit holders, to do work that that we're not able to do because we don't have a license. And, so you got distributors like picking stuff up and dropping stuff off. They're, volunteering the time of their employee. They're paying for the gas, insurance on the vehicle. We have to get the cannabis when we're getting it from a cultivator, we have to get it tested. So we need labs to provide us free testing. We've been working with Spark the past few months, and we've done 3 giveaways there so far. And so it's like with 64, I'm not allowed to be plant touching because I don't have a license. So it's got to be the employees there. So again, Spark is volunteering the employee work hours. So it's really, I feel like compassion is really based on, compassionate companies that want to see this happen as well, because it's definitely a team effort. It's team compassion, and, it's pretty tricky navigating the supply chain and making sure everything is, passing through everything and hitting the deadlines. It's complicated.
And just like really to go to the heart of some of these misconceptions, I think when we were, having to testify at hearings and, address different issues that people had as this law, was proposed 2 different ledge cycles, it's not as if Sweetleaf or, any of these compassionate care programs are just indiscriminately just giving, compassionate care donations to anyone. Part of the requirement of even being a program is, maintaining records and having, different patient groups and, making sure that you have agreements with those patients, and certainly for you, your work has been with, a very discrete population, of terminally ill people, in San Francisco. I was actually mentioning Ed before.
Yeah.
I don't know if you
Good
want to
old
say
Ed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, Ed, he was, coming to a bunch of the hearings. He was a patient representative of people who receive compassion. He's, a senior, he's low income, he's a veteran, he's completely blind, he's almost completely deaf. He has HIV, and last year he was also diagnosed with cancer. And so this is a prime example of people that need compassionate cannabis. They can't afford it, and they have very large handicaps, like multiple terminal illnesses, also being blind. And, these are the people in society that we need to help out. We got to be compassionate to people who are in these sorts of positions.
I mean, it's in some ways really heroic just to have seen this bill finally become law, because, we had patients like Ed right up front. Scott Wiener was very committed to making sure that the patients spoke and were represented, and that, people like you and, Sean Kiernan from Weed for Warriors and Operation Evac, Ryan Miller. I don't want to leave anyone out, and I know I am. Oh, Sarah.
Sean was one of our early guests.
Oh, excellent. Sean is incredible. I mean, it's like one thing
Love
we have
that guy.
anything about was that, like when we did hit some really hard points, as some people said, it was like regulatory whiplash. Committees had concerns, specific senators had concerns, like analysts had concerns, and Sean Kiernan from Weed for Warriors and his veterans, all of the different chapters, Elizabeth Ortiz, tremendous single mom, veteran, patient, activist. I mean, these are people that went into Republican state senators' offices who have veteran constituents, veterans and their family who are veterans, and talked about the fact that we've got right now, and Joe and I've heard this statistic far too often, 22 veteran suicides a day, many of them connected to opioids. PTSD is very effectively treated with cannabis for some of these veteran populations. As so they've testified. I'm not making any claims. They have testified. There's studies even. And, you know, at the same time, it's also something where the veterans, you know, like Ed that we mentioned, very much need to have, you know, access as they did under 215, you know, to donated cannabis because they're on fixed incomes. They often have all sorts of complex of symptoms that can be effectively um, assisted with cannabis. And you know, it kind of goes straight to the heart of so many of the issues that Americans are facing, including, you know, lack of effective coverage for, you know, some of these major health conditions that, quite frankly, you know, have been shown to be better treated with cannabis than many other things. So, yeah, it's just, I honestly like, if anything else, I was just praying throughout, and I know Joe was, and so many of the people we've spoken of, that we could have this win because it truly has been an emergency, and the emergency isn't totally over, right? You know, there still are, you know, major access issues for patients, even when we can get these giveaways and when we can have, you know, these, you know, licensees committing to different programs, you know, in the future, next year, and even, you know, in this last year. It's like, this is truly exceptional, to say the least, that with all of these taxes and all of these constraints, some of the businesses have stepped forward.
Yeah,
Sorry
it's great. It's great to see that.
Yeah. Anyhow, well, I guess one thing we were talking about too, and Stephen, I know you've got your mic off, but you know, Joe, when we were talking about the history and lead up to SB 34, we were talking about Dennis Peron, and maybe you could speak to your own connection, because recently, you know, we were talking about SB 34, and it's just so great to hear you talk about the early days. You know, I hate to put you on
Oh,
this,
yeah.
so important so people
Yeah.
know what we're talking about.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's amazing how far we've come with cannabis. When I was first involved with medical cannabis, you know, it was 1996. Dennis Peron had his Buyers Club in downtown San Francisco, and you know, they were really doing a lot of good work. They made the Compassionate Use Act. You know, they passed Proposition 215 in 96. And, you know, Dennis really paved the way for a lot of people. And Dennis Peron and Brownie Mary really prioritized compassion and helped kind of like put that into the foundation of our industry. And yeah, back in the day, it was crazy. In 96, Normal, I think I still have one of these brochures. Normal made a brochure that we would circulate to doctors, basically explaining to them about their First Amendment rights, because at that time, the federal government was going after doctors like Dr. Todd McArea and trying to take away their license to practice medicine because they were giving cannabis recommendations. And this is when California had legalized medical cannabis. So it was pretty crazy that the feds were going after doctors. I think that case went to the Supreme Court, and it was ruled as First Amendment. The doctors have the freedom of speech to talk to their patient about something that would help them, even if the federal government says it's really illegal Schedule I substance. But yeah, it's the history of the industry. So much has changed. So much has happened. I really think the younger generation right now probably doesn't know a lot about that history, and it came with a lot of fights, you know. Dale Schaefer's one example. He went to jail for like 5 years for doing a medical grow.
I just mentioned Dale earlier as, you know, one of the lawyers who stepped in along with me, you know, and the different programs and
yeah,
advocates. But you know, one thing that I loved at the beginning of all of this, so early on, Joe, I remember a week after Dennis Peron passed away, I was invited to the castle, and I think you were there, I'm pretty sure. and Wayne was there, and Laura, and many others. And you know, I guess really early on when we decided to go to these hearings and ask for help, when you asked for help, when Ryan asked for help, you consistently said, this is for Dennis. And it's so
Yeah.
great that this last cycle, it was actually worked in, you know, to the law to name it after the first two activists, you know. And I know that you were pointing out too, and I always benefit from hearing this, that, you know, not just Dennis Peron, but Brownie Mary herself, like, just continued to help patients and refused, even when she was threatened by, you know, arrest, you know, and true civil disobedience at the heart of, you know, the public health emergency going on in San Francisco. Um, and it, I mean, not too soon after these laws were created, you know, were on your bike in San Francisco, like, you know, delivering medicine to people, right?
Yeah.
I think you told me once in the last year or so that it's the longest continuously running compassionate care program.
Yeah, I think that's the case because WHAM had that the DEA came in the early 2000s and busted them. But yeah, we've been continuously in operation for 23 years now, since 1996.
And I think also, like, one thing that I neglected to mention, and Stephen, feel free to interject or tell me if I should mute myself or what have you, but oh, there you are. Okay, good. Is
Yeah, I just have a little bit of background noise with here, not occasionally, especially with my chair. So I just mute my mic when I'm not talking, that's all.
Oh, okay, cool. Okay. Well, one thing that we were gonna, I think, talk about too in the midst of all this was oh, San Francisco public health emergency, Dennis Peron, making sure it was in Dennis's name. Oh, longest continuously running, that many compassionate care programs did in fact shut down, right? Like Sarah Pan.
Oh yeah, a whole bunch.
I was just on. She's an amazing activist, educator. She's a consultant. She's an officer at the Apothecarium, and she's now a commissioner. And she has the compassion seat of the new commission in San Francisco. She was a former co-chair of the SF task force. She ran a compassionate care program, and that's something that she had to testify about for a very long time. Is like right before the January, you know, regs were implemented last year, she had to tell her patients, and so many other programs had to tell their patients that they either were going to have to, you know, give a certain what they had in their stock, and let their patients know that they might not be able to give them anything in the future, almost like a stockpile, so to speak, or just a last donation. And I still think there's a lot of compassionate care programs that have not been able to come back online. I mean, it's, you know better than
Yeah,
I.
it's been difficult. It's been difficult. I mean, it's been tricky for me to navigate it. And, you know, it's just a lot of people in the industry don't have a lot of bandwidth right now because everybody's just kind of struggling to survive. So, you know, I've talked to different dispensaries and people want to get compassion programs going. It's just unfortunately not the highest priority.
Yeah,
you know, I just saw something today about how BCC has put on hold like something like 400 licenses because people aren't on metric yet. And so it's like some of the dispensaries I've been talking to, you know, things have been pushed back because of metric. And so, you know, it's just so much for people to be doing right now. But I feel like when things even out, we will see more compassion happening.
Definitely. But you, I mean, the other thing too, and you've spoken to this at length and really honored it, is that the farmers, the farms, the cultivators that you know, and many other programs originally worked with, the legacy small farmers, there are some, along with, like you've said, the dispensaries and some of the distributors like Flocana, over the last year have still been able to set aside at different points, you know, it's certainly by no means regular, some donations for compassion, which, you know, hopefully, right, next year we'll see even more of. But the one reality, and besides what you've just said, and just the very unforgiving conditions right now, the steep margins, the different, regulatory kind of drop off points or extinction events people have been talking about, to be able to survive and to designate, just a portion of some of what folks have, it's very hard. And if it's not done before it goes to distribution, even under SB 34, the cultivation tax that's been paid doesn't get to be rebated back. So if I say it another way, sorry, Stephen, I'm going really specific in this law in California, but unless you designate that cannabis is for donation, for compassionate care, before it goes to the distributor, then the cultivation tax is not relieved. It would have already been paid, and it can't, we've been told by the regulators, it can't be somehow like recaptured or, somehow alleviated. But I think that that's probably the next, what we've been saying is the next phase, or at least something that, Joe, you've been wanting to have happen for the future, right?
Oh yeah, that's definitely for the three big points that we're looking to in the future. We'll be addressing all the compassion tax at all the different levels of the supply chain. So like Anne mentioned, it only becomes compassion when the cultivator designates that before it goes to distro. So what we're seeing in the supply chain right now is a lot of at the distributor level and at the retail level that's not selling. And no one wants to destroy this. People want to get it to compassion, but the issue is having to then pay taxes on something that you're giving away, something that you're already taking a loss on. And
right.
So that's one of the things we want to address, as well addressing the possibility of getting a non-profit permit category, like a license type.
Yep.
And then really the really big ask I'd really love to see is some sort of California state tax credits for cannabis businesses that are participating in compassion. So something kind of like what you see with regular nonprofits who are 501c3, you get tax deductions on your federal taxes. But since we can't do this federally, we'd like to see it happen on the state level, and then people get deductions on their state cannabis taxes. And I've also been talking to people in San Francisco, and I think we might have some momentum there to deal with the city and county taxes, because they're also kind of high in San Francisco. And so one way to possibly alleviate that is that if people participate in compassion, they also get, city and county tax credits as well. I'm trying to hit it on both levels.
I'm just thinking right now to two people that I really wanted to thank, that, Joe would back me up on just as you're speaking, are Max Michelonis from K Street, also Jackie McGowan, and I know Nicole Elliott, who now works for Governor Newsom, but was the director of the Office of Cannabis when she was in San Francisco, was very committed to getting some local guidance and recommendations in place. The task force actually created some, and I know that she very much was engaged even up to the very last part of getting SB 34 passed, and I wanted to honor her and mark that. But one thing, Joe, too, that you're so good about discussing as well in terms of what we talk about, like what the law does and doesn't do, is physician's recommendation versus medical.
Oh yeah.
Right? Because like some people, including some of the journalists out there, want to make it sound like any old person can just like go and get a compassionate care donation. I kind of almost wish that were the case. If you need it and you're, have a medical condition, et cetera, et cetera. We know there's way more constraints, as you just outlined, than even, businesses wanting to help patients and the like. But there was back and forth, both leg cycles, this issue, right, of whether or not you needed to have a county medical card or whether a physician's recommendation alone was enough to access compassionate care donations as a patient. So, tell me, since I brought the, I don't want to just spell it all out, at least for your patients and for some of the others, what the important distinction is here and why we fought so hard on this point.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, the big thing is that those state cards, A, they're not free, and then B, you have to do multiple appointments to actually get one. And so with a lot of our patients being indigent, they're terminally ill, but they also suffer from mental illness. And so many of them have social workers that will accept their SSI check at the beginning of the month and make sure all their bills, and then get them the leftover money because they don't necessarily have the wherewithal to do all that themselves. So asking a patient like that and requiring for them to navigate something that's probably on the level of like getting a driver's license, like an ID card, it's going to be very difficult for them. And another thing is with that state ID card, the veterans were really concerned because that would, if they got that card, then they're on record saying that they consume cannabis, and then they're now no longer legally allowed to possess a firearm.
Right. Which
so that was another concern for the compassion community.
And that's something here in so I'm in Oklahoma. Well, I've been working a lot in Oklahoma. I'm about to head to Africa, but in Oklahoma, there's 3 separate statutes that protect gun rights for medical patients in the state.
Interesting.
So, and it's something that technically I guess is against federal law, but when you have state protections on it, you can have there's no limitations. But good luck trying to get literally any gun right protections in California. It's
I think, so there's a whole bundling of constitutional law rights, really, when I, want to just call it out there, which is rights to medicine, your Second Amendment rights, your right to privacy, in certain circumstances as a patient, particularly when you're a veteran working through the VA system. Okay. And so I said it on record, and I know Joe will agree that, we did fight the different advocates to keep barriers accessible. I did say low, but accessible, for veterans, for the terminally ill, like Joe, mentioned. I mean, it really, you have to pay $100 to get this card issued by the county, and it would take multiple appointments. And one thing Joe mentioned many times over in these hearings is that there's some counties that had 3-month long wait lists. So you'd have to make an appointment, then hopefully be healthy enough to make it to your appointment 3 months later, and then lay out your basis for why you needed the card, pay for it, and then come back, or however it's processed, is at least a 2 appointment process. And that's just far too difficult, actually, for someone who's got major medical issues and may even be in the hospital when their appointment is supposed to take place. It's just not tenable. And more than anything, I just would love to see more instances like Joe's talking about that become almost regular and institutionalized, if we can have that. Right now it's truly is down to goodwill and economic feasibility, for sure, for these different licensees to be able to help. But you brought up a really important point, Stephen, which is California now, historically, on the law now, coming into 2020, will be that we finally have reinforcement protections for compassionate care in California. And what that means is that in Colorado and in Washington, that have those 2 states, when they had medical programs and then introduced the adult recreational market, that those 2 states actually, my understanding is that compassionate care did not survive, if at all, or barely, very little. And so now hopefully we can inspire people in those states, activists and stakeholders, and also in these states that are starting to incorporate beyond just medical rights, to make sure that the transition in places like Oklahoma, right, where we're talking about, where there are tons of storefronts, I don't believe that there's institutionalized and almost a support, if not a requirement, to donate some of the cannabis, right? So that's at least I know what Joe wanted to inspire. I very much am committed to. You know, we met, speaking on this point, like a year ago, a lawyer activist from Australia who's working on like compassion in Australia with patients there and veterans, and you know, is intersecting with the opioid crisis there as well. And it's like these concepts, we really, you know, the people that testified in the Capitol, and I know, you know, the various lawmakers that supported it and sponsored it and voted for it, ultimately want to make sure that this is not something that becomes extinct. And I really hope it inspires other places, because there's, Joe can say it even better than I, but there's so much of a need, you know?
Yeah, and I think you have a really great point there, that what we've done is we've created a roadmap for other states to be able to incorporate compassion again. I think that's really important.
Definitely. Definitely, because it's not as if there aren't medical patients, you know, that are terminally ill, that are veterans, you know, some of the children, the patients there that have very specific conditions. I know that's another patient population that was very much a part of this push, you know, to get this law created. Those patients exist elsewhere, and I'm sure that there are, you know, groups, hopefully, that, you know, have, even if it's informal, you know, tried to help. But you know, there's nothing that needs to stop licensed businesses through the regulated marketplace, you know, do the right thing. Joe and others have referred to it as compassionate capitalism. I personally just think that, you know, it's something about the consistency of maintaining some semblance of patient rights. I hope that there's much more in the future, because it's a rough time right now. I mean, I'm very preachy about this, but Joe, you can speak to that more than I. And I'm sure Stephen in Oklahoma, I don't know, you know, how people are experiencing access to medicine, but you know, it's, I'm sure there's room.
Yeah, there's no room for donations or anything like that here. There is a lot of stuff that gets rejected from state testing that I'm sure is disappearing to local avenues, but you know, obviously that's not stuff you necessarily want people getting either. But yeah, that's not anything that's in any of the bills here. And you know, I was thinking what you're saying, you know, it would be nice to see a 1% or 10% or 5% or 2% automatic donation of product as far as cultivation to these types of things in a state, or even maybe a city. You know, it'd be cool to see maybe somebody like Chicago or New York or somebody like that to adopt, you know, something like a 2 or 3%, you know, cultivation tax, where they just donate, you know, their, you know, 3% of their weight to these types of programs, and then maybe reduce some of the tax burden in exchange for that, you know.
Well,
Definitely.
Berkeley does require that. Berkeley is the only place I know where they did a voter initiative for the city of Berkeley, and I think it's 2% of a retailer's gross revenue, what they take in during a year. I think 2% of it needs to go to compassion.
And I bet, I could be just speculating, but I bet that BPG and others in Berkeley were a part of that. I know Etienne Fontaine, who's one of the founders and principals there, and then I'm just thinking, I'm completely, Sabrina Fendrick, there has been instrumental, both, you know, locally in Berkeley, but also in Sacramento and nationally, you know, fighting for patients' rights. So I bet they may have been a part of that. I wish I knew, but I mean, that's just a start. I hope the commission in San Francisco, you know, starts to revisit some of what the San Francisco task force started to propose in terms of recommendations. But then, Joe, you also touched upon this point too, right? Like the state of California, even though we had this big break, so to speak, and a real kind of triage and a shortage of cannabis donations, they are doing a nonprofit feasibility study. Statutorily, they are bound to do that. And I know, different compassionate care programs have been contacted. Joe could probably speak a little bit more on this point, but it's the frustrating part about like, you have the regulated market rolled out with this complex tax structure, compounded taxes on the local level. There's a lot of problems there, of course. And then in the midst of that, this feasibility study that's pushed out 2 years, even though there's a patient need, right? So it's like, great. Hopefully we'll have some kind of proposed regulations by, isn't it 2020, Joe? That they have to issue it?
Yeah, I think they have to wind up their nonprofit feasibility study. I believe it's January 1st, 2020.
But it's almost like in some ways, I don't want to speak too harshly about this, but looking at how hard it is for a commercial licensee to get their license, pay the fees, do all the different things, have the security and the other requirements, and operate. We definitely have wrestled with how would one do that as a nonprofit, and that's really an open question that California hopefully will stay committed to answering. But in these other states too, it's like, what would that look like besides a local tax? What would it look like if there actually are people who are strictly devoted to being a nonprofit, kind of like some of these older models like WAM, where maybe you have vertical integration, starting from cultivation all the way to patient, or at least some portion of a business that's devoted to compassionate care, whether it's the testing services or the like. But these are times where we have to think really creatively, and we have to be like super tenacious. I mean, I'm saying this because before this law was actually signed this time around, I think it took many of us like so many surrendering over, because it's taken so long. And quite frankly, Joe, I know, could say something on this. We should have gotten this the first round.
Yeah, it would have made things easier.
It would have. And also, Joe, something that we were talking about before you joined was just the connection between small farmers, and even like I'm working on appellations, but like some of those small farmers that are stakeholders and stand to benefit for a cannabis appellation framework, they're also some of the same groups and individual farms that donated to your program and to other programs, right?
Yeah, like Happy Day Farms, Huckleberry Hill Farms, Mood Maid, Circadian, King Range. Really the people that are supporting Compassion primarily are the old school, small mom and pop style growers.
And they're like precisely often the same people that are really engaged in regenerative agriculture, being sun grown in these areas that are doing work around cannabis appellations. And they're also sometimes the cultivators that are really still focused on the genetics that are beneficial, the very specific genetics that are beneficial to patients, so that it's not just, bottom line growing a very high THC plant, but also like, some of the really important characteristics that maybe would be overlooked in other contexts. I mean, this is...
Oh yeah, and these people too were the ones that were all growing organic before it was required by the state. These were all the trailblazer style people.
It's so, we've had to emphasize so many times in these hearings how important it is that, like, when people use that tired metaphor about like shining the light, in the darkness and all that, there are all these assumptions about how things operated. And one thing that has blown me away is just the built-in voluntary compassionate care donations that inspired Prop 215 and were carried out, in these hearings and at other points when they brought up, diversion and all these fears. It's like those cultivators, those communities, didn't have to set aside a portion of their harvest at any given point, and just give it away to these programs and to these patients. There was actually a lot of, I don't want to like romanticize it, because Joe, you can actually speak to the realities more than I, but like there was a lot of good, whether it was like institutionalized or whether it was, something much more local and inspired, right?
Yeah,
know.
totally. Sorry, I had it on mute there. Yeah, I mean, I feel like in my experiences, I've talked to so many different people who cultivated and, would hang compassion out, not necessarily like, make a whole program about it, but, hand out some free medical cannabis to somebody who needs it. And, it seems like a thing in the industry. People know that the plant is really helpful medically, and, they give it away free to people who need it.
I wonder too, like, how, because we don't really fully understand all of the different things happening to the cannabis plant, like both just like in the, different practices that are going to support it in, the near future and even currently. Gosh, I'm saying long sentences here. But like there is, as you just pointed out, this interesting relationship between, the stewards of this plant, in these smaller communities that are very much, trying to create a balance, like a sacred balance, working with the land and practicing regenerative agriculture, practicing these closed loop systems, and also seeing, I mean, I sound lofty, but I think you would say too, like it's like a sacred economy, building and giving back to the very people that inspired the laws and making sure, even if it's not required, right, that patients were still having their needs met. And now that we have all these way more complicated overlaid systems like metric, track and trace, and the taxes, and the supply chain itself, and when you designate and how to even get it, once you're at a licensed retailer to the patient. These are all things that are getting ironed out. But I just like have to speak to the fact that it's even been able to get accomplished at all. Like there's a certain level of grace. And I'm just like so hopeful that like in the long run, we can have a lot more that protects the patient like we're talking about, and also protects these small farmers. Because like, Steve and I were talking before we started to go on air just about some of the economic forces at work right now, and some of the contraction that's going on, and just how tough it is. Like you point, 400 licenses were suspended on October 31st in California. Some of them were suspended because they're just not active. They're not businesses that are operating per se. But all of them were businesses supposedly that had not completed their track and trace, the metric training. And so it remains to be seen whether, a large portion of the supply chain will be able to come back online, so to speak. And when I say that, I think there's like half of the, I may be wrong, but half of the distributor licenses may have been affected. Some self-distribution licenses, some storefronts, but we have that, there's cannabis stocks now that are trading at the dollar mark.
Well, here's a question though too, like how much of this year's crop got affected by the fires, by the smoke?
Right. I mean, so we're not through the fire season, and Joe knows. Joe's up sometimes in that area, right, Joe? And in the Emerald Triangle and the like, and some of the fires.
Oh yeah, I'm up here right now.
Yeah, the Kincaid fire they just put out, which is in Sonoma. But our fire season isn't over until we get rain,
Yeah.
That's my understanding. And Joe, have you heard anything like just out in the field about how people have been affected? Or oh no, there was the power outages, right? That was part of it too.
Oh yeah, I was wondering about that because I figured that would probably affect the indoor people. Like that's going to be a pretty big kick in the pants.
Yeah.
I think the fires this year, I don't think they affected as much as in previous years where like, people would have their grow all smoked out and then it, the flowers smelled like barbecue afterwards. So I haven't heard as much of that going on lately. But I think that was more prevalent during those like Mendocino fires, the ones that were, there was a lot more cultivation happening around them, I think. Because I don't think Sonoma has a huge amount of cultivation. I feel like I was talking to someone recently and they said that I think there's like less than 500 permits in the whole county.
Yeah, it's been a difficult place to license, is my understanding. I don't know it as intricately, but I do think that part of what I've been reading, it's like this weird juxtaposition where, you know, some of the farmers that are off the grid, for example, that, you know, rely on solar and have their own generators weren't as impacted, if at all. But then, you know, because of the point of harvest right now, you know, there are different places where you know, people are processing, or where they're not even processing, they're curing. And, you know, the facilities where the flower is being stored as it's being cured need to be kept cool. And I think that there are different circumstances, both for folks that are indoor and for folks that are sun grown and we're just curing, you know, in some capacity where, you know, they were adversely affected because they weren't able to keep the cooling systems on, or, you know, other other
dehumidifiers.
Yeah. And I think like we don't fully know the scope of that. The other interesting thing is that for the areas affected by statute, I know I'm kind of geeking out here, but or sorry, by regulation and by statute here in California, there's some protections for disaster relief. So I think there were some counties affected by the fires where they were able to get some grace period for paying their taxes actually during the outage. And also what the outage and the fires pose really are that they're like all of these very specific, not the most forgiving requirements when you lose power. And as a licensee, doesn't even matter what kind of license other than storefront retail, when you lose power, you lose track of the electrical system, you're not on metric anymore, and you're not allowed to move product at all whatsoever. There's a few you know, guidelines that allow for some emergency disaster relief, like moving of product and the like, but you actually have, or not moving products, sorry, but some operational things that you have to account for if it's a disaster. But even so, I think that people, whether it's the, you know, the cooling, or whether it was having to pay taxes, or whether it was just like, you know, dispensaries who as storefronts, I think are allowed in some limited capacity to operate, at least initially, if they're still, you know, if they've got generator power and the like. But even them, you know, they were impacted because they didn't have customers coming in. You know, it's like I think there was a dispensary up in Humboldt that had only like a fifth of its normal, like, you know, customer flow then. But I don't know. I guess the long answer, the long-winded one, is that it remains to be seen the economic impact of the fires, but we're still not done. You know, we're not through it yet. I'll probably have a better answer for you when I get back from Humboldt after this weekend. So.
Awesome. So did you have anything else you wanted to mention on SB 34 before we move on to the Appalachians?
Let me see here. Joe, I'm going to defer to you. Is there anything that you want folks to know beyond some of what we covered with like what the law does and what it doesn't do, and what we want for the future, and, you know, why the past is really important in terms of the legacy?
Yeah. I feel like we hit on most of the main points, local, state, regulation, legislation.
Did you
the
want to
fact
mention,
that, you know, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Did you want to mention what you got going on, the stuff you were sending me today?
Oh yeah. So we're doing a giveaway with Hall of Flowers in the upcoming week. And they're getting to Sweet Leaf compassion patients and Operation EVAC compassion patients little like gift bags with an assortment of topicals and flowers and concentrates. And yeah, this is all cannabis products that have gone through the regulated supply chain, and This is a completely legal giveaway, and it's just exciting to see more of this stuff happening. We've also, over the past 3 months, been working with Flocana and with Spark. And so Flocana donates product that's not really moving, but is still looking great. And I've been doing fundraising to pay the taxes on that cannabis, and then Flocana gets it to Spark, and then Spark gets it to our patients. So Sweet Leaf now is no longer plant touching. We just operate within the regulated supply chain and sort of guide the donations to the patients. So that's been great. Over the past 3 months with Flocana and Spark, we've given away cannabis with a retail value of around $50,000.
Well, it's neat that you're able to find a solution to get around that tax burden, and through donations and people helping out that way. It's really wonderful that was a possible solution for you. And that you're able to find some companies that can do that.
Yeah, no, it's been real great. Definitely the community is coming together in support of compassion, and it's heartening, gives me hope for the future.
I'm so glad you joined us, Joe.
Yep.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, guys. I don't know much about Appalachian, so I might wind up signing off here.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate your time, man. We're talking about you. You messaged me like right before the show, and I was like, you know what? I'll just see if you're free and you can come on and talk about your stuff. And it was relevant to what we were saying, so I just thought it was good timing, and I thought it would be neat. So thanks for joining us.
Well,
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
Hey, Joe, can you kind of blast out some of your important, like, I hate to be a promoter, but like socials, or how people can learn more about your efforts, all the other stuff?
Yeah, we mainly do stuff on Instagram, so follow us, Sweet Leaf Bay Area. Anybody who wants to donate or get involved in compassion, feel free to send me an email at sweetleafjoe@gmail.com. Check out our website, sweetleafcollective.org. And I think that's all the shout outs.
Awesome, Joe. Well, hopefully we'll get to connect in real life soon, and I'm so glad you called in.
Yeah. Well, thanks, guys, for having me, and have a beautiful evening.
And you're totally still my hero and many other people's hero. Thank you, Joe, for all the work you do.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Bye.
Sure.
Bye, Joe.
Thank you. Awesome. Yeah, thought that was just funny timing. So
that was so synchronistic. Well, that's like, I mean, when I started to tell the whole story, like, Joe's a huge part of it. Like, I was sitting there, Ryan Miller had a slide. He asked for legal support. Joe was right there. And, he's just been an amazing person to work with and a real inspiration. I know he didn't mention it, but I'll just say it now that he's off air. In the 3 years leading up to regulation, so before 2018, Joe on his bike delivered through his network, but specifically just, in San Francisco, $1 million worth of cannabis to terminally ill patients that he has worked with consistently. And it's been incredible to meet those patients, to see them testify. And, I really just can't say enough how much it's been an honor, like a true honor. I can't understate it, like really an honor, my career, just to be able to help and support people like Sweet Leaf and these other advocates and their programs. It's just if anything else, I'm so glad. I think right when Joe called in, I was saying that I'm so glad that we had this win, because I think that the community, the cannabis community and the cannabis industry need to have some really good templates and really good examples where we can say we're actually making some progress and we're making some long-term commitments to some meaningful legacies and advancing things forward, both for the patients and for the people and for the plant, and like even really to honor the things that operators have been doing for a long time. I really look forward to making it easier for medical patients to be able to get access. And so, yeah, I don't know if you want to segue or how much time we have, but I can definitely talk a little bit more about appellations if you want.
Yeah, if you want to explain to us Appalachians, explain to us what Appalachians are, why
Sure.
people should get involved with their local Appalachia group, how it can benefit them, and why it's important, especially with the growing international market.
Definitely. Okay, so first off, most people are confused about appellation and what it means because they think that it's like referring to maybe like the mountain range, the Appalachian mountain range. And it actually is something that's a French term. So if you think of just like the word appeal, um, in these different systems, like in France, when we look at certain kinds of wine or cheese, Champagne is a perfect example, Camembert cheese, Parmesan cheese in Italy, um, and even wine in California as well. These are all different contexts in which there are appellation rights. That is where the producer, the cultivator, the creator, the farmer is able, kind of in a collective way, um, to create goodwill that they protect, that's established, that in a way is a not a certification but a standard that's met. And in the creation of it, you actually make an appeal. You put together a whole petition, so to speak, to a regulatory body. And if we think about it, well, it first happened in Europe. There's some folks that are much more versed on the history than I. Janine Coleman at the Mendocino Appellations Project, Justin Calvino. They're both amazing speakers on this topic. But what it really means is it's creating a regulatory framework in California. There's a statutory requirement to do so, to create cannabis appellations or a framework for it by 2020. And right now, we are awaiting the California Department of Food and Ag, the CDFA, to issue a packet that's going to set forth the proposed regulatory framework for cannabis appellations. That's a big mouthful, but if we want to think about it another way, it's like if you can imagine special kinds of craft cannabis from particular regions here in California and hopefully in other regions as well later, that are able to protect, so to speak, the appellation right or the mark. So kind of like when we see, different kinds of appellations of wine from Napa or Sonoma, different sub-appellation groups where you'll see in France, like the AOC, the Appellation Origin Contrôlée, where it's a certain standard that one can inform the consumer about on their product. And you can't do that unless you are able to actually get this standard, so to speak, established and proven as a right holder. That's a big mouthful, but one way to revision it or to kind of conceptualize it is that this is one of the times where farmers can actually start to dictate the terms and conditions upon which they cultivate and a value for that. So, for example, farmers in Mendocino growing out in the sun, Humboldt as well. These, Trinity County. I've worked with Big Sur farmers, farmers, in these regions where there's both a documented history of cannabis cultivation, very specific, almost like microclimate or biospheres, where you can see in very like isolated geographical areas, like think of Big Sur, right? That's a very special little system, especially the backside of the Santa Lucia Range, where you can grow in a way where there's not a lot of pesticides, where there's maybe some special conditions, like with fog and clean air and, different other flora and fauna. And ultimately, these same farmers that are growing in these, very traditional and also very innovative places ultimately may be able to protect what they're doing and be able to have some kind of mark and certification on their cannabis that signals to everybody, hey, this is the special Mendocino sub-region craft cannabis, or this Big Sur, appellation, or this, Willow Creek, Humboldt, sub-appellation cannabis. And why that's important is because, as Joe was talking about before, and we brought up it in California right now, it's very hard to operate, to meet your margins, to carry your tax burden, to do all the different things that a licensee has to do. And it's especially hard for small farmers, right? It remains to be seen how many will survive this first year of regulation. But what we're trying to do is create, and when I say we, both farmers, the CDFA, the stakeholders that they engaged, they actually had a working group. This is very cool. The regulators had a bunch of different farmers and a bunch of different local government agencies, I believe, and also trade associations participate in their working group to talk about how you create these laws. And the neatest thing about it is that if it's done effectively, cannabis appellations in California will be an international standard that can be harmonized in other countries and can set, just kind of like we're talking about in a different way with compassion, will set it's basically an intellectual property protection if, and it remains to be seen, we can harmonize it with different international treaties and, in some way create what is going to be the first example of a protection here in the state, that small, hopefully, well, I don't know, it's going to depend on the different kinds of farmers. We got to that before about, well, what kind of farming and who will qualify, but for farmers, for organizations to be able to start to create something that actually signals what we know the consumer already wants, right? Some of the best cannabis in the world comes from California. It comes from, the Emerald Triangle. It comes from, like when I mentioned Big Sur, that was one of the first places where cannabis actually started to be cultivated. And when we talk about appellation rights too, this is the mystery that we don't know yet from the state. Will it just be, when we're talking about appellations, geographic, just special locations and those subregions? Is it going to go to conditions that the farmer works with? In some countries it does. That gets to be a lot more complicated. But, when we see all of these different systems become integrated, right? We have different state siloed systems now. We may have descheduling at some point, unscheduling. Hopefully we'll have the borders open up as well. And when that happens, and before it even happens, craft cannabis farmers, the state has already recognized, will have some kind of framework to protect what they're creating and to be able to signal to the consumer, hey, just like this, special bottle of wine that came from this region and was, grown, here in California, that's, certifiable and protectable and, can't be claimed elsewhere. Same thing for, these different subregions. And I become so animated about it because, like I said, there's like this cool crossroads of like tradition, the actual agricultural practices of, small farm, craft farm. That one of the big controversies, and I'll kind of slow this down so you can interject, is the question of terroir, right? So land and the natural environment and how it's expressed through the cannabis plant. And the lawmakers, the policymakers, and some of the different, stakeholder groups, have very much had to marshal, different concepts and facts to talk about that, yeah, there's a difference, experiencing cannabis that's been grown in a warehouse and never seen the light of day. There is a difference. And from that, and from, the cannabis flower that's been grown in the full sun, in an isolated region, that doesn't have some of the same conditions and might also have a lot of beneficials, all sorts of different other plants that are being grown around and near it, and other different like flora and fauna, honestly. I mean, so the working group happened and getting ahead of myself, I co-chair the International Cannabis Bar Association's Appellation Committee. And we are going to be working to put together a symposium with UC Berkeley School of Law, Cannabis Law Society, and the Haas School of Business. And what it aims to do is to, while we're waiting for this packet, it's supposed to drop this fall, it might drop in the spring, get together some of the best, experts and minds. Richard Mendelson, who created the wine appellation system in California, who served on the working group, who is very much committed to seeing forward, a workable system for cannabis. He will be a speaker. There's going to be a panel with someone from the California Department of Food and Ag, probably Richard Parrott, and Janine Coleman, who's from the Mendocino Appellations Project Origins Council. There's going to be a panel on cannabis IP, like trademarks, collective mark certification marks, and how they relate to appellations, and also the business case for appellations. Because, you know, so many people are like, well, do people care? You know, and that's a whole place where we were going. And then alongside the business case, right, and we could talk about that for a second, is also we're going to have a panel on science and sommelier, because the terpenes, the different expressions of this plant grown in what we're talking about, you know, that's appellation worthy, very much can be proven. We're already starting to see, you can imagine the cannabis plant, you know, when it's grown in these ideal conditions, is going to have a whole range of different things that will show up in tests, terpenes alone, that will be very different from, you know, what's grown in a greenhouse. So I should like give you some space to ask questions, but at least I plugged that. And I know there's more to say about it, but yeah, what else to cover there?
I was just going to say, is there any challenges you've had trying to form the different Appalachians? And then is there limitations on like other states? So what if people are in like Oklahoma or Florida or some of these other far-flung places that maybe don't have, you know, any kind of concept of what, you know, maybe they're doing in California?
Okay, I'm just going to move my computer so I can power back in. So bear with me. So yes, perfect question. Thank you for asking, because it kind of goes to the very importance of, you know, why we want it not just for California, but how it bears for the rest of the state. And for example, right, in other states, I know Oregon specifically is very interested in the future of appellations, because just like, one thing to cover is that there's very much an overlap between the wine community, between viticulture, and between cannabis, because a lot of the historic regions that may have appellations developed for cannabis are also regions where there is wine, or where there's, like I said, regenerative agriculture. So that's definitely something where I know there are stakeholders in Oregon that are very much interested to see a successful regulatory framework rolled out here in California, so that they can hopefully, you know, adopt something similar. There definitely are, as you know, like cultivators in Oregon that have a lot of the same things and same, how could I say, like elements and requirements that would benefit for an appellation: small farmers, traditional farmers, regenerative agriculture, farmers growing in, you know, these areas where we have, you know, a terroir, so to speak, because it's proven and shown in wine and in other places, Washington State as well, Oklahoma, other states. You know, it remains to be seen, because part of what we're talking about really is, and this is in what the CDFA looked at, the causal link, right, between the environment and the plant. And as we know, cannabis is a bioaccumulator. So I would say, and you know, some of the, having sat through the working group, I'm not a scientist myself, but I'm definitely appreciating and very much having to speak it and, you know, love it, is that, so when we talk about making that causal link, it is tied with not just the land, sometimes it's tied with the water, sometimes it's tied with other geographic elements that will, you know, that are proven and demonstrable to influence the cannabis plant. So I would posit there, because we're not totally there yet for other states, but I've heard other people talk about it off record. What if you have regions, for example, that have very rich minerals in their soil that are good for cannabis? I'm not talking about problematic ones, of course, because we've got heavy metals and all sorts of stuff in different places. What if you have regions in other parts of the country that have incredible water sources, you know, they're really impeccable, pure, whatever? I think that there totally are places where we can make a case for it. But certainly when we talk about it, we're contextualizing it in the context of both history, culture, practices, terroir, right? And so I don't see it being exclusive to California by any means. And I think that there is a beautiful possibility internationally to talk about terroir, you know, for some of the other areas where we know that these cultivars and strains have come from, right? India, Africa, as you're familiar, some of the places where we've got some really incredible genetics that, go back to the pharmacopoeia for a very long time and teach us, right? I guess that's kind of a long answer. So yes, I would like to see cannabis appellations in California. I'd like to see it, for, of course, those places that we talked about before. And it remains to be seen when we create something that is workable, that means something to people, then I think there's a lot of other factors we can think about. Like to give you kind of like a different conceptual model, normal folks are just like, what are you talking about? And I'll be like, okay, it's cannabis and like, wine or cheese. But I was actually in Maine this summer in this really pure area. It's a place where I've gone many times where, the water is really clean. There are these like rivers and bays. And I was standing at a market looking at oysters, and I was seeing the different markers of like, somewhere nearby that I had been. And then like upstream, there was this, my friend was explaining to me that there's this like bay where they've actually cultivated oysters for like hundreds of years, like Native Americans had middens and stuff. And I'm sitting there going, there's an argument, like the consumer wants to pick a good, a crop or a plant, or, here we're talking about things where we don't have the mark yet, we don't have the appellation, but the consumer knows that that environment is special. And that oyster is going to taste different when it comes from that bay that's been kept clean and has that unique geographic signature in that location than, another oyster from some other place. So I know this seems tangential in one way, but in another way, it's kind of like, well, what is it we're protecting? Who are we protecting? How do we enforce it? That's an open question, right? Because in Europe, that's another thing. In Europe, they're almost like guild models. Like I know Frenchie Cannoli like posted this amazing video of the Parmesan region, and there's like a whole minister of agriculture that's like devoted, just this, this person devoted, and the agency to making sure not just the cheese, not just the fields, not just the cows, but like the whole thing in Parmesan, like the way that farming is done, that everything is protected, so that you don't actually impact this beautiful craft Parmesan cheese that has to go through all these different things to be certified. So it's like this. Now, I don't know that we're ever going to get quite like that here in California. That's a whole other thing, but it's like, what are we protecting? Because the thing that we're talking about is actually protecting, the environment, the people, and the very like plant or grape or cheese itself, right? And that's super exciting. There's a lot to unload. It's not easy. I think one issue is going to be like long-term. It's a collective right. Okay, so we're talking about not everyone gets to use it, but like farmers within a group. Hopefully they have a trade association or some body, we don't know yet, who will enforce or go after and advocate when, let's say, some cultivator in another part of California is mislabeling something and saying that it's from a Mendocino subregion and that it's sun-grown when it's not, and when it's actually grown in different conditions, maybe indoors or maybe not quite anywhere near what we've been discussing, which is commanding quality that's based on the environment, a special way of potentially conditions, right? Of doing things, and not just like make cannabis, if I can say that. So yeah, there's definitely some atheism, or definitely some like big questions people have, but there's also like so much passion, and there's so much overlap between, the tourism industries that will benefit the small farmers in these regions that maybe aren't just cannabis farmers, but by virtue of everything else, they are, farmers that are, practicing regenerative agriculture and also growing fruits and vegetables, and, able to command more for, what they're producing, because it's an appellation, not just for cannabis, but for other things. I mean, there's some really cool possibilities, but I think there's definitely a lot of laws to harmonize. And, the best thing is that the advocacy on the ground level, making sure that these things were in the statute so that we could, have these different state agencies, look into it, and also having, a governor who has said he's committed to this. So I've heard that, and I'm going to say that on record. I've heard he's committed to Appalachians. I know he comes from a wine producing family. And, if we're going to look at the long term for California, there's really some
He is
important.
also, he is also allowing the National Guard to spend $100 million to go after growers on a weekly basis too, though.
Right. So that's the thing where, like, when we started, and I felt like maybe I don't want to come across harshly when I say war, but we've got whole regions where we're talking about
Though. It is a war.
That's what I'm saying, where we have small farmers that are in different processes of trying to get online. It's not easy, to get all of the different things that you have to do locally plus the state. And, one of the biggest points everyone has been making, especially lately, is that we need to provide more opportunity and ability to license first before folks are gone after in a militaristic style. I agree with you. I was not trying to glamorize Gavin Newsom.
Oh, no. I wasn't trying to say
yeah.
that you were. I just wanted to counterbalance that with some of his other recent actions.
Oh, no. And that's the thing is, I think, ironically, when we talk about resources being wasted, because we are talking about state agencies and resources, there have been instances over the last 6 months, especially in places like, Mendocino and Humboldt and Trinity County, where you have, national or federal resources being coordinated with both they deny it, but with local law enforcement, flying over farms, licensed farms, sometimes farms that have had, tens of thousands of dollars of damage sustained when you can easily see that they're licensed, going after farmers that aren't even farming cannabis. That's happened too. Farmers that are just vegetable farmers. And really, honestly, I've heard over and over from regulators, I've seen it in print, that state resources are supposed to be devoted to going after the worst actors, which are the ones, they say, that are polluting, the national parks and forests, and the ones that are, maybe engaging in unfair labor practices and, human trafficking even, the folks that are the worst actors. And from what I've seen reported, there are instances where perhaps the state is, committed to that, but there, like you pointed out, there are plenty of other instances where people are having, 6 BCC representatives show up to make sure that they're compliant for a very small delivery service, when supposedly there are these, not supposedly, there are bad actors and working on a much larger scale than a licensee who is just, there and responsive and able to show you their SOPs, Like, there's a huge discrepancy in terms of what we call enforcement right now and how resources are being allocated. I would love to see more resources, allocated to Appalachians, because, like I just started telling you, there's a huge amount of resources that need to be committed. And myself, as a lawyer doing pro bono services, I, was encouraged to work to do this work, in different groups, because I was working with small farmers that needed help. I showed up at a CDFA workshop, okay, over a year ago, where they said, this is the Appalachian, what did they call it? It wasn't the working group yet. It was like some kind of informational meeting. And they basically had butcher paper out, like these huge pads. And they had, farmers and different folks show up. And it was literally like that, like blank slate, like, hey, what do you guys want to do? What do you think an Appalachian should be? And I was like, oh my God, we need so much help. I mean, what we're talking about is, again, like, not just individuals or businesses, but like groups of farmers getting together to put these petitions together and successfully have them be processed by the state, and then have it, a system be implemented that is workable for Appalachians, where we can make sure those farmers doing, whatever the requirements are for an Appalachian live by it, and the ones that aren't, they don't get to benefit. And so, building out that in the face of all the other things that are going on, I just want to say that, all the farmers out there, whether they're working in communities where they've had to fight to get the ban lifted, like in Calaveras, or, you know, places where there's still bans and, you know, where people are being constrained, or places where there aren't bans, but it's just really hard to license. This is about like the long game. This is going to take a long time. And this is just the beginning, kind of like we were saying about compassion. But, you know, it's very much at the epicenter of, you know, what's good for the earth, you know, what's important in terms of climate change, what's actually like sustainable for our land, our communities, you know, what's healthy, what creates healthy medicine. And ultimately, you know, in the midst of like what we're talking about, like these crazy economies of scale internationally, regionally, how we deal with silos, you know, when we've got craft cannabis growing in California, Oregon, and Colorado, and then, or Colorado, what am I saying, Washington. And then we have these other parts of the country where, you know, we're just starting to license, and maybe we don't even have the same kinds of growing conditions or traditions or, you know, regions and all of that. It's like, this isn't for the faint-hearted, I guess. And
I feel really bad with, you know, how many people dive, or especially in the last year with the hemp stuff, have dove headlong into the industry with no idea about what they're getting into and how vicious this industry can be, and how the, especially on the regulatory end, you can have the rug pulled out right from underneath you. You could suddenly have your main product be announced as illegal and never be legalized again. That's happened to some products I've done some R&D on. You know, all different types of things that can happen to you. You know, imagine if you're a vape pen producer right now. You've had sales have plummeted by 60% if you're selling vape carts, you know, or so you're selling bulk oil. You know, there are no people that are selling on 55-gallon drums right now. You know, like, good luck trying to move that stuff. So they're, you know, they're trying to turn it into edibles, trying to turn it into other stuff, and trying to find somewhere on the market. But now that market's getting flooded, and you know, this is the kind of stuff where if you don't have multiple contingency plans on how to retool your offtake and retool some of your production, you're screwed. This happens a lot, and people don't realize it. So you're especially seeing this now, where people bet their farms on this hemp stuff. Maybe had Fusarium, botrytis, or Septoria, or something else. Didn't know what they were doing, or didn't know how to properly manage it, or didn't you know, didn't have very good soil, or maybe they had a flooding. You know, a lot of places had floods this year and had a lot of additional, you know, pest pressures that weren't normally part of the normal you know, equation, you know, and that they just weren't banking on, or they just didn't have any experience, period, with it, which is a lot of people planting way too dense and or not dense enough, and all this other stuff. So now you have it with these new regs that they want to put forth with the USDA, make it 0.3 after decarboxylation, which is completely asinine. You know, if you look at the 0.3 regulations, those 0.3 regulations came from a USDA ruling from 1974 under the Carter administration. And that testing for 0.3% explicitly said from leaf tissue, okay? Not from the buds, like they want to do testing for. They want to cut the top 2 inches of buds off and test that, okay? We know that's completely ludicrous. You know, that's not what the original regulatory structure that they put out back in 74 said, that they're using as the basis, and they're citing as their number and the reason for the number, which is this previous USDA ruling back in the 70s. So that's completely ridiculous that they're going to use that as the basis for it. And thank you to Oregon CBD. They actually did a very well sourced and well written article. If you guys want to learn more, go check it out. They did a really good thing on that. But and I know I don't want to get too much into it, because I think we're trying to get Dale Hunt on Tuesday to really get into it.
oh, cool. Oh, good.
Hopefully he'll be with it.
He can definitely, I would definitely bring up appellations with him. I saw him at a panel at Meadowlands where he spoke, and Janine Coleman and from Mendocino Appellations Origin Council, and let me see here, Rebel Grown. I'm trying to remember. A few cultivators were on the panel as well. And I know that he's been doing some work. I think that in terms of plant patents and the like, that's like a whole other time and topic, and how genetics plays into it.
We've covered that quite extensively in other episodes.
I'm just going to make this very hard emphasis stop here. Richard Mendelsohn said this live. I've said it over and over to folks. In France, when they set up the appellation system for wine, part of the requirement in those petitions, or that, the appellation itself, when you are trying to create the basis for your protection of the particular region and practices and the like, they were required to specify the cultivars, right? And here in California, we do have this language about standards, practices, and varietals. And so it has been advised that when farmers, and we don't know yet, we don't have the packet yet, but we've advised over and over that farmers not just lock in one type of cultivar or different types of cultivars they've traditionally used, because climate change is upon us. And in France, they kind of locked in specific, like you think about it, Chardonnay, right? These certain kinds of grapes in these regions. And so we definitely are going to need to have the ability to both, cultivate and protect cultivars that are traditional to the region, but also to allow for innovation and to allow really for like the farmers to exercise their craft and their stewardship with the plant, because it's going to change over time.
Now, could they set up something like, a regular, every 5 or 10 years or 3 years, add new cultivars or some kind of regular review?
I mean, I think a lot of it just remains to be seen, because so much of what we're talking about is like theoretical, right? And it could go a lot of different ways, and it's going to require some moving parts that haven't even really been identified yet. But I do think that, like, even though we know that there are certain regions where traditionally, like, some cultivars have been grown very successfully and have a certain kind of terpenoid profile, for example, and no plant is always the same every season, et cetera, et cetera. But working with that, I think there's something to be said. But even so, the again, the farmers, I think, need to have some really important say here, along with the scientists, because you don't want to build a whole system around only certain types of cannabis cultivars, when in fact, a region may, or even a sub-region, there's certain types of plants that are going to come, that are going to show themselves, improve themselves to, over time, be more optimal, right? And what we're protecting, again, isn't just the plant, but the farmer and the region and the whole enchilada, or the whole, like, Janine Coleman says, it's kind of like layers of the onion when we talk about what the heck this is or what is being protected. But the onion's real. It's just there are all these different layers, right? So there's definitely a piece there.
I always think of it like, well, I had the pleasure of going down and spending time down in Westmoreland in Jamaica, and I'll leave the town out to keep some of my friends out of trouble. But we ended up going into this town on the coast, and down on the coast, the village up above has like their docks and everything all set up for moving different agricultural products that they grow. And then you go up to the hills, and just up the road from there, and they have this whole town. It's a whole village. There's probably 150, 200 people there, and the entire village works a massive multi-acre grow, and processes it, dries it, cures it, moves it, packages it up, and everyone gets I think it was 100 pounds per harvest, or per month, or per XYZ amount that they can then cash out or distribute or whatever, and that was part of their payment. It was real interesting. This is years ago, so it's nothing recent, but it was just interesting, and always made me think, makes you realize how they literally, like, this whole probably 400 or 500 people, between the two areas, are supported by this one agricultural field, and it was just kind of crazy.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, is like, I don't know exactly what that climate or that, specific spot and place was like, and what kind of cannabis was like, produced there in those conditions. But that's really, when you talk about appellations and terroir, and what the heart of this is, it's place. It's how you protect the cannabis plant cultivated in these special regions, and the farmers who intervene and steward, along with what is being kind of expressed naturally, right? It's like you try to isolate what it is, or it's a couple different things, but certainly like what you're describing, it's my IP law professor that is my mentor, rest in peace, Keith Aoki. You talk about seed saving and these different like innovations over time as being thousands of years of collective knowledge. How we protect it, how we reward it, what it looks like, what it's based on, how we prove it. That's the future. And
Yep.
I hope that we can do this work that we're talking about in time to save the practitioners, because they're at the heart of this too, right?
Yep.
But I mean, there's so many different practices in different regions and communities and countries where, like, I don't know, every time I see articles about the charas making in right, like that,
Love charas, tastes so good.
like those areas, and what like that I mean,
They call it gum in Jamaica.
and I've heard even those communities, right, are being subject to a lot of change and conditions.
That's what I was. So that's what I was talking about. Is that's also one of the other things they make up there. They can get extra harvests out of it that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's something like when we go back to oysters again, like there's something there. There's definitely a lot to be proven, but how do we create some other like value and protection and a system to further support those traditions so that they don't disappear, but so they're able to actually continue to teach all of us and help us emerge as all these conditions are changing. I mean, not to bottom line it too much, but I can only imagine in those traditional regions how much natural change we're seeing, and what it's going to take to keep those traditions alive, right? Yeah, just astounding. I mean, it reminds me actually in one of the advisory hearings going back to SB 34, there was one of the cultivators, just talking about like the kinds of protections we want, for small farmers, and they were just going off about how it's all in the pharmacopoeia. I kind of want to say that too sometimes. Like there's so much amazing natural work that goes on, and then there's also like a lot of really intense, very much powered by man, sometimes not so natural production that's going on as well. And I definitely, I know you wouldn't have me on talking about this, you too, like want to be on the side of assisting those traditions and elevating things.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, and then for other people that want to get a better perspective on how an Appalachia or a regional production can support it, look up the documentary The Union. It explains how at one point about a third of Vancouver was grow houses.
Wow.
So, and the whole top to bottom on how everyone from police officers to judges to school teachers had second houses that they were growing, and it was completely crazy there for a while. So it just goes to show you how when you have a regional production, even if it's even illicit like that, it drives the economy. And now when you go back and look at areas like Redway and Happy Camp and all these other places now, they're desolate. Happy Camp has one store within an hour and 20-minute drive. There used to be 6 general stores that you could get products from, and that's a huge expense on those people that live up there. They now have to drive a good hour, or 45 minutes, where they used to be able to drive 15, and they don't make a lot of money to begin with, and it puts a lot of extra strain on these communities, and people end up just leaving. There's not a lot of, it sucked the money out of when they came in, and they were heavy handed with the regulatory stuff. They just sucked the money right out of the areas because there's no more money flowing around, especially Redway. Though I've been there 3 separate times, and man, has it just looked like a absolutely night and day difference from the first time I was there.
It's like seeing how things are impacting communities, and also watching how discussions about water rights too and other long-term issues that remain. I'm just speaking, to these different regions in California. It's very intense. I mean, the one thing that I think everybody underestimates is how complicated, how much resources, both, monetarily and also like employees, it takes to make this transition. And it just, makes me think about the footprint of these economies and how they operated before. Because I've even heard like there, are instances where roads and schools and all sorts of things were created through, smaller communities where those resources wouldn't have been available otherwise. And so I'm not glorifying that or saying like that's the answer, because the state and the voters and everyone have already, expressed their will, so to speak. But the real issue is like in, wherever we look, where there is some form of so-called legalization, who's left out, who's allowed to get online, what that looks like, what the, product is, whether it has medical benefit and has integrity. And even if that can be scaled, those are so many things like that remain to be seen. And then, at the same time, these infrastructures and communities and really like informal, ways of, carrying out goodwill are like not at all the same. I don't want to say that they're all dead, because like tomorrow I'm just going to plug it right now. I'm going up to House of Humboldt, which is put on by the Humboldt Growers Association. And it's basically, a bunch of local cultivators and operators, licensees who are able to showcase their work to other licensees. It's a B2B event. I believe it's sold out, but I'm super excited because it's up in Humboldt, and it's, the actual farmers coming out there and being able to engage with the other operators and licensees, along the way, distributors and retailers, so that, we can support being able to, have this market remain viable and, eventually, I'd really love to see it be a lot easier. I mean, like 80% right now of California still doesn't have storefront access. And, Joe pointed out earlier in the call, that so many licenses have been suspended. So, I'm just putting it out there in the midst of the fires and everything else that we've talked about, that, our cultivators that are, have been brave and have, stepped forward and made these tremendous efforts are, able to continue on. It's, the struggle is real, and I'm so inspired by them myself. And, having other folks like Sweet Leaf Joe and just the intersection between patients and, what medical cannabis and those laws were created for, and, this transition of, being able to preserve those things and also integrate other aspects like appellations is really exciting. But the other elements out there are pretty intense as well. So I hope that's at least optimistic, like a optimistic realist here. I do believe in both of these different arenas that we were talking about. So
Awesome.
yeah.
Well, I appreciate your time. We're just about to wrap up. I really appreciate how much time you've given us, and getting into all your awesome work with SP34, and then talking about the Appalachians and all that, and really helping us get to better understand that. And for people out there that are, in other markets, to have kind of a template and some other legislation that has been passed, they can use, to reference for their own states when they're trying to make, a lobby for why they should have compassionate care laws, and gives them the resources and to reach out to, people like yourself to get that stuff through, and you shoot, even if it's just as far as, hey, what legislation do we need to have in our legalization bill for, if you're in a state that hasn't legalized yet, make sure you can get these provisions as part of your bill. so that people don't suffer, and you don't have medical patients that are relying on this plant, to survive, getting left at the wayside.
So well said. Absolutely. I mean, there's that, let that be everyone's North Star, really. Like with this is, talking with Joe and others, it's kind of like we're both, protecting some of the best things from the past. And we're also like, we've got to create a very vital, healthy future for everyone in this. And that means patients, businesses, especially, the people taking care of this plant. And it may take a very long-term commitment, but absolutely. So thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. And yeah, so how do people find out more about you, and if they want to contact you or work with you on any of the stuff that you're working on now?
Sure. So I serve as of counsel at McAllister Garfield, which is a multi-state law firm, and you can check out my bio at their website, mcallistergarfield.com. My email address over there is ann@mcallister.com. And I also have a practice at Kelson Law Group, and you can contact me also as well, akelsonesq@gmail.com. I'm sure there's some way to contact me through INCBA also, but yes, those are the ways to find me, and I look forward to it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot. And thanks everybody for listening to the show. I've been just working on a little bit of stuff, working on paperwork for Africa, and then actually have a quick trip off to Texas next week to go talk to somebody about a big grow in Texas, which kind of blew my mind, but apparently that's happening soon. So that's crazy. But I'll be back again. We'll have the show normal time Tuesday and Thursday next week. Thursday, we have Harvey Smith, who will be on the show. Those of you that have seen the NPK University videos, he's got a lot of great educational information out there. So if it's something you're interested in learning more about, definitely check him out. He's definitely one of the better sources of solid cannabis education out there. He'll be joining us on Thursday. And yeah, Tuesday, tentatively we'll have Dale Hunt. Still waiting to confirm. If not, we'll have somebody else on that's really good. And yeah, you can find the podcast at your favorite podcast app on YouTube, SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Podcast, all the different places. Working on getting caught up on the WeedTube and a couple of the other oddball sites. I've lagged behind a little bit, but we'll get up there. And shout out to True Aquaponics. Him and I are working on hopefully getting that project soon for you guys having the dosing services available on subscription. So that'll be ready here in the next few weeks. Certainly by Christmas we'll have that ready to go. And yeah, we'll look forward to seeing you guys again soon next week. And thanks everybody for joining us tonight. Take care. And please go out and support Nick Risden. He's really been through a lot. We touched that in that beginning of the show. If you can show him some love, we'll make sure we post a link on a way to support him, or get him some donations if you guys want to help support him in the struggle he's going through. All right. Thanks a lot, and we'll catch you guys next time. Cheers.